Okay, so I thought you deserve a break from PowerPoint presentations, but not from discussing power, which is something that I'd like to do mainly in the second part of my talk. The general outline is here. The first part, and I'm talking mainly about nanotechnologies, is that things could go wrong at the lab, and therefore in the human body and the environment and so on. And I will be talking here on thoughts on technological optimism at an age of uncertainties, and also on risk management and the precautionary principle as they look from the social sciences and from the environmental movement. And the second part will actually be more optimistic, or at least you'd think that to begin with, and it will assume that everything does go well in the lab. But the question will be, are we really covered in that case? And this is where I want to go into socio-political and ethical dimensions, and into some thoughts on governance, the democratization of knowledge, and technological innovation as part of the commons. Issues that came up yesterday and today, and I will try to say some more remarks about them. Let me just move this. I was told that I have about 30 minutes for this presentation. So let me begin by saying that as a social scientist, I am a trained skeptic. I was trained to observe what people do, and that includes cutting-edge scientists. And I was trained to keep an open mind about their cognitive maps, how they think about the world, as well as their practice, what they do. Not all of my presentation, however, is based on skepticism. I'm convinced, for example, that nanotechnologies can revolutionize industry, and in that respect, I buy into many of the promises of nanotechnology. This is also why I chose to speak mainly about nanotechnology rather than about GMOs, which is also covered in this conference. It should be quite obvious for many of those who have been here since yesterday, and maybe even if they came here without much knowledge of nanotechnology, is that the ability to control particles under 100 nanometers, 10,000ths of a millimeter, does not only introduce us to a new world of miniaturization, which has its own advantages, but it catapults us into a scale whereby materials behave differently in counterintuitive ways. The movement from normal mechanics into quantum mechanics, as was said yesterday, is really mind-bending. And scales with uncannily high ratios of surface area to volume can be very useful for industry. I accept that, and I see this as a promise. This has and will have far-reaching implications in terms of conductivity, fluorescence, and insulation, lubrication, coating, and many other industrial practices. There will be new materials, and we've heard about this in this conference, new solids, new fluids, new powders, with some extraordinarily useful properties. And they will have a growing array of applications. Hard disks of 100 gigabytes, the size of a small coin, is one thing that is already here. But labs on chips that will have nanosensors and can be inserted in an organism, including humans, is something that obviously has a lot of promise, and I'm convinced of that. Delivery of drugs in molecular quantities to specific cells. I think on the whole, in terms of miniaturization, we see a powerful validation of Moore's famous prediction in the 1960s about the relationship between downsizing and technological advancement. In short, what we have here in nanotechnology is an enabling technology that can transform production practices and goods in fields as varied and as diverse as agricultural and food production, healthcare, energy, transport, clothing, information technology, and many more. As an environmentalist, some of these, and I will not go into detail, some of you know it, have a great environmental promise. And I think that the ubiquitous nature of potential applications of nanotechnologies make it more akin to inventions such as polymers in the 1930s. And if we want to be even more melodramatic, the wheel, the spring, the screw, control of electricity, pneumatics, perhaps semiconductors, all of these are techniques that became keys to advancement in a variety of fields, and I think this is what we have here. So nanotechnology and its emergence obviously creates good times for technological optimism. The sense that technology would remain the white knight that leads humanity into advanced stage and more welfare for all. And I'm not about to join organizations like etc., etc., and their demand for a moratorium on experiments and innovation or public spending in the realm of nanotechnologies, far from it. What I do want to do is to have another look at the following questions. Are we also, with nanotechnologies, entering a brave new world in terms of risks? Ulrich Beck, the German sociologist, has described modern society as risk society more than a decade ago. His main argument there is that modernity, as part of a more rational approach to uncertainty, has developed a structured strategy to cope with risk. Risk can be calculated, quantified, assessed, commodified into actuary tables in medicine or insurance. This is a very enticing, tempting pastime, this treatment of risk. And contemporary society, Beck argues, is replete with institutions that dedicate themselves to managing risk. And we are all socialized to do so. Yesterday's talk by George Gray was an excellent illustration of that. Yes, known risks are based on past actuary experience, but the risk industry is confident also of its ability to tackle, theorize, extrapolate, and calibrate new risks as well. It tells us that we are safe in its able hands. Does nanotechnology then stretch the limits of our capabilities to analyze risk? Is there an analogy between the unpredictable, counterintuitive, paradoxical behavior of materials in the nanoscale, on the one hand, and the risk-benefit balance associated with it? Can we assume there is no connection, an analogy? People who are part of the nano world, academics as well as people who are in industry, seem to be genuinely convinced that all this risk talk, sometimes raised by people who are skeptics, is hype. They seem to reflect a belief that the familiar natural history of technological advancement, the procedures that go with technological advancement, from concept to experiment to invention to patenting to application to production to marketing, has enough checks and balances built into it along the way to locate bugs and safety loops and fix them. And I think the story of C60, as told yesterday by Professor Osman, is an excellent reflection of this spirit. It is a tale of assumptions that blew in the face of scientists, very candidly told, unanticipated, counterintuitive problems that were encountered, uncanny behavior of substances, but in the end, scientists who applied well-known methodologies and overcame obstacles to develop a usable and hopefully safe product. It is a valorizing tale, one which boosts our confidence and buttresses technological optimism. My question again is this tale reflexive enough about the positionality of those who tell it? The positionality of those who tell it, I think, is a key factor here. And it came up in various presentations today. Scientists who are at the forefront of advancement are extremely important social agents. The world as we know it would not have been the same without them throughout the history, not only contemporary world. Their place in the world is dependent on the belief that innovation is always possible and positive. They have a sense of mission. They are believers, even prophets. They are competitors, fierce competitors. They are trained in scientific thought that teaches trial and error as a normal day-to-day procedure. They have the justified sense that they are the only ones who really know what happens at the cutting edge. Society entrusted them with resources and prestige and sent them there to the cutting edge. But do all these excellent and admirable inherent qualities of scientists living on the edge make them the best assessors of risk, of concerns, of acceptable level of precaution? Or is there something inherent in their positionality that in fact limits their propensity to produce a balanced view of all this from within? In this respect, there is an element that might be unique to nanotechnologies. When we accumulate knowledge, we also strengthen our conviction that we continuously reduce uncertainty. This is the business of knowledge, to build up knowledge and to reduce uncertainty. But do not innovations in a tricky field like nano actually produce uncertainties as we go along it? Isn't it mind-bending in a sense of increasing uncertainties with innovation rather than decreasing them? Something which I suggest we should consider as unique to nanotechnologies. And there are institutional considerations. Research institutes are involved which have interests, agendas, strategies, institutions that increasingly rub shoulders, and perhaps other parts, with the corporate world. Corporates are not inhabited by evil people. Structurally, however, and Dov Chenin has mentioned this earlier, they are geared for profit, sometimes in the short term, preferably within the current fiscal year, or at worst within a decade. Investments must mature and yield, right? People in cutting-edge science often think that onlookers do not really know, that they feed on digests, reports for mortals, or worse, rumors and hype. They are difficult to convince people in the cutting edge of science that the possibility of things going wrong should be treated seriously. Look at the nuclear power industry before 3 Mile Island or Chernobyl. And I stress the word convince. I said they are difficult to convince that the possibility of things going wrong should be treated seriously. I stress convince because it leads me to my next observation. The nano world is interesting, even novel, in as much as its discourse includes, from a very early stage, strong language in favor of sharing knowledge, communicating knowledge to the wider community, democratizing it. Most reports include a very impressive list of institutions that actually make it their business to communicate scientific knowledge with the outer world. On the face of it, this is a very encouraging development, which I think is characterized nanotechnologies much more than previous technologies. A closer examination of this discourse, however, can be revealing and very relevant to the current debate. And there are two observations that I'd like to offer here about the language that the nano world is using when it comes to its interface with others. One is it describes itself repeatedly, and we've had our share this morning, as a small nation surrounded by enemies. I think this is something that comes out quite often, and I observed it, and I keep observing it. It's not small by any means in many other objective ways, but it sometimes has a self-image, and the recurring, the return to the bad example of GMOs is part of this. The second observation is about the reasons that are given and sometimes transpire in terms of why to enter the dialogue. And I'll explain what I mean. using one or two examples. In June 2004, the European Nano Gateway, an EU-funded initiative promoting nano, published its fourth Nano Forum report. It called Benefits, Risks, Ethical, Legal, and Social Aspects of Nanotechnology. And on page 85, it says this: a certain amount of honesty and transparency can provide faith and an understanding of the reasons behind decision for the general public. In this regard, the Institute for Prospective Technology recently published guidelines for risk management. So when we look at the way the initiative to go public and to approach the public is framed, it's talking about a certain amount of honesty. It doesn't talk about full honesty or full transparency, but some of it can be manipulated to provide faith. Another example is this, from the same report. Today, fears which emerge must be calmed by implementing a real discussion between the different actors. The dialogue between scientists and the general public must avoid past mistakes, as was the case for GMOs, with the absence of distinction between various techniques, contempt of information, and an incomplete study of the risks, legitimately caused a massive rejection by the general public and a general mistrust with respect to the agro-business. I am uneasy, as you can obviously see, with such language. They seem instrumental, strategic, goal-oriented, a bit of a spin, really. They seem to say, deep down, we in Nano do not really need public approval. However, because we are in the know. There's a lot of knowledge statement in these two examples. We are compelled, however, to do so in order to avoid the unnecessary, unjustified failure that befell us with GMOs in the last round. There, we did not do our risk analysis on time. We did not communicate it well enough. Let us do better this time. I happen to think that nanotechnology is too important for this kind of approach. And a dialogue that is not based on a genuine sense on both sides, that both can teach and learn from each other, will end as nothing but a campaign. And campaigns, as we all know, and as in a way GMO told us, can be won or lost. And I think, again, the nano industry, including its agents and collaborators inside academia, will do better if it recognizes the limitations associated with its positionality to analyze and assess risk. And if it were to internalize the possibility of risk, of things going wrong somewhere along the line, and be reflexive and critical about technological optimism. There are smaller subsets of strategic argumentation that should be indicated, and I will only mention one because it's already been mentioned today. The claim that comes up in many of the arguments for nanotechnology is that really nothing is new, that the technology has been here long enough, the problems have been here long enough, and so on and so forth. It immediately throws everybody off guard. I think it is very important, and I'm saying it as somebody who believes in the industrial potential. It's very important that we all agree that we are at a defining moment of a cutting-edge technology, and we resist inertia. So these are some thoughts that deal with the possibility of some things going wrong and how we deal with that possibility and risk and so on and so forth. I want us to end this with a few words about a different scenario, if you like, a positive scenario. One whereby all does go well. Risks prove minimal, fears transpire as overrated and hyped, and the next years and decades see the promises fulfilled, applications developed, safety loopholes identified on time and covered, and there is success. No mishap, no Bhopal, no Chernobyl, no GMOs scenario. And I want to talk a little bit about the price of success from a social and political point of view. In Bertolt Brecht's formula, will anyone pay the price? And if they do, who are they? Where are they now? Where will they be in 50 or 100 years? The story biotechnology and nanotechnology tells itself and the world about itself is simple. We will feed a hungry world, cure the sick, do good for the community and for humanity at large. Nanotechnology's claim is even bigger. We will revolutionize materials, instruments, industrial processes, health practices, energy efficiency, food, textiles, and so on. And as I've indicated, I firmly believe that these ambitious claims are warranted, technologically speaking. But let us look for a moment at contemporary global political economy. What is the political, economical context in which this new brave new world is entering? Post-Fordism has reorganized production practices since the 1970s. It remodeled the old economy into a new world order. Production centers were chopped up and moved from the Midwest and the Midlands and similar territories in the West to everywhere. Peripheral states compete for investment and employment in a vicious circle that has been called the race to the bottom, lowering environmental standards, lowering wages and workers' rights, and so on and so forth. Inequality in terms of profit sharing became deeper in the world as we know it in the last quarter century. Then came information technology and took advantage of this transformation that had already taken place before it. The microchip industry in India and Malaysia are the later incarnations of the same process. Keyboard operators in Jamaica working for American insurance companies. You call train inquiries in Marlborough, England, and a young woman in Hyderabad tells you of the next train from the station down the road to London, where she has never been. There are international hospitals in Thailand and India that are bigger than any international hospitals in the United States and treat up to 350,000 Americans and others who come there for cheap but very good treatment. The biotechnology industry is using testing grounds, production sites in third world countries. The local agriculture and economy go through a process that could be called politely restructuring, that's a nice way of putting it, and could be called impoverishing through dependence and monoculture, and through exposing its environment to dangers of proliferation, and so on and so forth. And of course, all this happens on the background of financial deregulation that makes the race to the bottom all the more problematic. Now, I think that here too, nanotechnologies could pose even graver challenges. Research and development and production are very, very expensive, we know that. They require more elaborate and expensive infrastructures. The goods and the procedures that will come out of it will be available mainly for those who can afford them. Citizens of the OECD countries now represent about 18% of the world population. It will go down to about 8.5% by 2050. So we could say, okay, these people of the OECD already enjoy better, safer cars and larger, faster hard disks and cleaner hospitals and better roads, electricity grid and sewage systems. So what else is new? This has been going on for a long while. You could say it's been going on throughout history. But let me use the example of healthcare to argue that in the case of nanotechnology, there could also be a new dimension of world inequalities, which I remind you, it does not push me in the direction of saying, let's have a moratorium, but it does push me in the direction of let's give another thought to maybe things that are lying ahead in a few decades. Imagine that nano will be able to enable those who can afford it to have nanosensors inserted, labs on a chip, perhaps at birth, perhaps in uterus in the future. They will be able to monitor genetic composition and predict likely carcinogenic developments. They will enable to take preventive measures to monitor ongoing processes and countermount them in time inside the body. In time, there could be an interface with DNA, bypass and eliminate defected sites, manipulate others, etc. Lengthening of people's life through these technologies. This is what the technology is promising us. And I think that it is within reach, that lengthening people's life could be dramatic. Not only a matter of a few more years on average, but actually people living maybe to 150 in 50 or 100 years. The lives of these people will also be enhanced. Diagnostics, monitoring, anticipation, treatment will lengthen their lives and make its quality much better. Cross this, as I say, with human genome and biotechnology, and you are in the realm of maybe artificial genetic improvement, reproductive edge, mate and offspring selection. The nanotechnology industry does talk of ethical dilemmas. It already is talking about ethical dilemmas. But here again, it seems to not to go far enough in my eyes. And it seems to think about ethics in an ethnocentric, maybe patrizio-centric way. Patrizio meaning rich and noble people. We are told that people who have labs on chips inserted to their bodies at birth will have their privacy invaded. True, and it is a problem. Some of them will not be able to be insured, we are told, and this creates new problems because of information that will be available about them all the time. Some of them may not be born, rejected by their parents or others at the signs of imperfect genetic outlook, for example. And as I say, these are valid questions, and they should be discussed when we are discussing ethics. But as a social scientist, I think that there are more pressing moral and ethical questions. These are, if you like, the troubles of the rich. And let me go far and beyond. Could mate selection, life-lengthening techniques and capabilities enhancing devices, mental improvement, for example, like steroids in sports, gravitate in time, in 2 or 3 generations, towards those who can afford to be part of this healthcare revolution? If this goes on a generation or 2 or 3, are we about to see a new biogenetic elite forming, which reflects people's current positions within states and across states in the world's political economy? Could this not be consolidated over time to become a separate subspecies of humans, more immune, more able to eradicate disease, live longer, become more territorial and exclusive about their ways of life and about the knowledge that allows them to lead this way of life? Of course, well, part of the problem, not part of the solution. As an anthropologist, the prospect of losing the unitary nature of the human race is, of course, a shattering idea. And I think this is where political economy is tangent to moral and ethical dilemmas, the likes of which we may have never seen. It's an enormous challenge. Of course, I could be accused of science fiction tendencies here, taking the fantastic to the phantasmagoric. One more thing that I see about the debate is that the side in the debate that manages to use the word science fiction first has an edge on the other side, accusing the other side of dealing with science fiction. So I could be accused of science fiction, but social science is entitled to its vistas too, when we are talking of a brave new world. And this is something that is worth thinking about. This conference is about the business of setting guidelines for an extraordinary industry, or what promises to be an extraordinary array of industries. I see myself very much as part of this project, not in the business of stopping it. And as I say, the early willingness of the industry to open up is encouraging. And the call that already comes from within the industry to maybe have a quota of a percentage that goes towards dealing with these kind of issues as I say, is encouraging. But language will not be enough. It will have to come from somewhere deeper within the industry and the way it sees knowledge, advancement, and its own natural history and development in the future. It will have to cater for risks in a more serious way, and it will have to cater for equality. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Professor Chaim Sukenik of the chemistry department at the Tel Aviv University. He earned his PhD degree from the California Institute of Technology, and his current research is focused on the biophysical design, biosensors, and nano-scale devices. Please.
Thank you.
First of all, I really do want to thank the organizers. I typically don't have an opportunity to attend meetings of this sort. I'm more than a little overwhelmed by the kinds of moral and ethical issues that have been raised. My sense is that they clearly go way beyond what one would deal with just in any single scientific discipline, and trying to put it all into nano or GMOs or any other one discipline is difficult. Let me do the following. I'm going to be shifting gears back to sort of the nanoscientist thing, and I'd like to, over the course of a relatively brief presentation, because my understanding is that we would like to leave time for discussion, I'd like to touch on some questions, some of which have been raised, some of which have not been raised previously in today's session and in yesterday's sessions, and let's see where that leads us. First of all, I'd like to talk about decision-making. I'm not a business person. I don't have industrial experience. So therefore, I'd really like to talk about those areas that I feel a little bit more comfortable, that is both education and research. There hasn't been a lot of mention over the kinds of adjustments that our educational system has to make in terms of contending with these sorts of advances. And along the way, I would like to raise some questions that I believe are related to that as well. We've been talking a lot about nano, certainly this afternoon, about what makes it special. And again, as part of these remarks, I'd like to draw together some of the things that were said earlier, both conceptually and also to perhaps flesh out some of the data that both Don and Reshef raised in terms of Israeli policy specifically, because I think that's the kind of thing that we really have to be talking about here. First of all, it's quite clear that nanoscience is now contending with a number of features that are not absolutely unique, but that are sort of backing it into a corner. It is clearly a highly interdisciplinary activity that is, as we've said before, you can't come from just one perspective. But something that hasn't been mentioned so much and that is very much in the minds of the researchers is that this is an expensive business. The idea that you could go into your backyard and take your garage and turn it into a laboratory and innovate was very much a part of the culture of chemistry, even that I was trained in as a chemist in the United States, say 30 years ago. That's just not true anymore. Okay, now we are living in an era where if you can't ante up the millions of dollars to acquire the instrumentation needed for progress, you're out of the game. And that, I think, is a factor that policymakers very much have to take into account. There's a certain attractiveness, and we'll touch on it again later in terms of centralization of facilities, but some of the concepts which did work, some of the paradigms which were relevant a while back, now we have to recognize that it's even the local researcher who needs this very expensive and seemingly redundant equipment often just to survive and just to make the kind of progress that we expect them on a day-to-day basis. So that's a factor that I think has to get into our discussion. The other thing that I think is special about what we're looking at today is that the world that we are living in today has brought together a number of circumstances that create a sense of urgency and a sense of forces and pressures on the decision-making processes that you're all involved in that I think are very important. The idea that things are moving from lab to marketplace rapidly was a phenomenon that the biotech people first started to contend with. It's clearly biotech and computers set the stage there. Things move rapidly, we have no choice already, that's it. They're moving faster than we could possibly anticipate. I think the other thing, when you listen to people like Smalley and others who talk about where nano may have its greatest impact, they talk about energy. Because at the end of the day, we are no no longer at a point where we can ignore the fact that petroleum resources are pretty much peaked, whether they peak now, they'll peak in 10 years or 20 years, that seems to be a consensus. Once they have peaked, and yet we're looking at emerging populations of consumers, of people who will have a major economic impact in the world, particularly in India and China, but certainly not limited to those places, we've got a problem. We've got a certain amount of pressure that's being created from that fact that we have to deal with. The other thing that I find interesting in the analogy to plastics, I'm from the generation of DuPont and Better Living Through Chemistry. Certainly in the 50s and 60s, and those of you who might identify with the movie The Graduate, there was a certain sense, there was more than an optimism. There was a surety that science is going to solve our problems, and we're now dealing with a more skeptical public. And that's good because it keeps controls on board, but now that decision-making process that we want to be more critical, more analytical, based on more thorough testing, has to happen in a more rapid pace and in a more compressed time scale. So we've created forces that are making it tougher to make the decision, but when all is said and done, we've got to do this prioritization process. We've got to do it well, we've got to do it right the first time, because we're not going to get another chance. The scale of the expenses, the sheer size of the dollars that have to be committed is so large that you're going to get one chance to make the decision. Okay? And it creates, as I say, a certain pressure that I think we have to recognize is out there, whether we want it or not. In particular in education, there are a number of features that haven't been mentioned, but that I think are also worth taking note of. We talk about education in a multidisciplinary environment. If you just look at the universities here in Israel, some universities have opted for undergraduate majors in nanoscience. Others have said, no, what we're going to do is we're going to keep our undergraduate majors very classical, and we're going to train engineering students and chemistry students and physics students. But then at the graduate level, we're going to take a more interdisciplinary approach. I think the question of how to correctly identify both what the elements are to properly educate this very broad scientist, by no means clear yet. It's an issue that we have to come to grips with. Equally important, once we know what those pieces are, this balance. If we're going to create people that start to be generalists from the ground up at an undergraduate level, I'm going to take just a little bit of chemistry and a little bit of physics and a little bit of engineering. I'm going to be wonderful in terms of making conversation at a cocktail party. I'm probably not going to be terribly productive in terms of the nitty-gritty of scientific discipline and the kind of progress that we'd like to see made. So that tension is, again, I think, a very, very real tension. People have commented before about the absolute necessity to incorporate ethical issues, and I think that's been said very eloquently, and I won't go to it again. There's an interesting trend that's coming along with it, though, which in some respects cuts against it, and that is, should we also be training, particularly graduate students in the sciences, with a certain amount of sensitization to business issues? In other words, if the Israeli economy is going to benefit from the creation of new small and medium enterprises, well, should we be taking our graduate students and our postdocs and already at the level of their training saying, okay, guys, this is what a business plan looks like. Now, I must confess that cuts against my brain in terms of science for the sake of science, but it may very well be that from a public policy point of view, there is something to be gained by sensitizing the science student to the very real timeline and progress of what his knowledge and what his training has to achieve to benefit the society that has paid for it. So I raise that as an issue without providing an answer. The last line here is one that I've heard in a number of contexts, and I want to make it clear because in some respects it cuts against some of the comments that have been made. Nano is clearly a descriptor. Okay? We use it as a noun, but like any shortcut or slang, that's an okay thing to do, as long as you remember where it came from. It's quite clear that with the development of new instrumentation, scanning probe microscopy as a good example, electron microscopy at the level that it's available today, with the development of theory that was able to take molecular scale phenomena and translate them into bigger phenomena, into bigger manifestations. Those are things that happened within the last 20 to 30 years that have now reached a point where the ability to explore and to understand that dimension of small groups of atoms and molecules, that's out there and it wasn't out there before. key issue here, when I ask is it a noun or an adjective, what's going to be 20 years from now, 30 years from now? The analogy that I would bring, for example, is in brain science or neuroscience. 30 years ago, I don't know if you'd find a single department in neuroscience. In the United States, I don't think there were very many. In Israel, I'm certain there aren't any. Yet today, neuroscience is not only a respected discipline, but it's clearly part of the permanent lay of the land of any academic institution. Okay, it's not just a child within the world of biology. It has established itself clearly at Bar-Ilan University. The Brain Research Center there is one of the most magnificent multidisciplinary centers with people from psychology and language skills and philosophy and physiology all coming together, sitting in the same building. Okay, working together, talking to each other, and doing research together. For nano, that has a very pragmatic difference. In other words, is nano research in the physical sciences something that I'm going to still identify as a separate discipline 20 years from now? Or will I simply take it for granted that anybody who is trained as a chemist will understand the rules of the game for nanoscale materials, will know how to use nanoscale tools for analysis and investigation, and maybe the whole idea of nanoscience and nanotechnology will no longer be something we will look at in a separate piece of the pie, but rather it will have been folded back in to the mother disciplines and to the fundamental disciplines where there are real differences. Am I dealing with subnuclear phenomena, or am I dealing with connecting atoms and molecules to each other, sort of going from the physics to the chemistry analogy to the engineering analogy where I'm building bigger and better things? So I think that's a very, very real question. One of the places that has had already, I think, serious manifestation has to do with the way the nano centers, and Reshef talked about this, and I'd like to just amplify it a little bit. Each university in Israel that has serious science research has established a nanotechnology center. They have different names. They have a variety of differences among them. I would say the first three items on this list appear in the mission statement of all of them. That is, they're all out there to achieve the interdisciplinarity. They're all out there to promote collaboration. They're all out there to create an umbrella where we can both share facilities and together try to achieve the funding necessary to obtain these facilities. That's apple pie and motherhood. The last two items turn out to be differences in philosophy in the centers. That is, to what extent am I already looking towards the application? To what extent am I building the industrial interface into my concept of nanoscience within the framework of the university? And there I would say there are real differences. I won't go into them, but I think some of the universities have made a strong commitment to hybridize, to blend in, to the point that some of the universities have made commitments not only to industrial partners, but to in-house incubators and other things of that sort. Others have not. So there are some very, very real differences there, and I will leave that. But I think there's a question which goes back to my issue of nano the adjective versus nano the noun that has to do with the structure and the role of these centers. That is, if nano is a real noun, something that's going to be around 30 years from now as a distinct entity, then we should all be building real centers, separate standalone entities. If it's nothing more, not to say that it's not important, but if it is only a descriptor, then we should be leaving people in their home departments. In the academic world, that means that my appointment will be in chemistry, not in nanoscience. It means that my tenure and promotion process will proceed through my colleague chemists and not through my nanotechnology colleagues. Those are very, very real differences, which I think will impact the way it works. Now, in Israel, this was a snapshot that we presented about a year ago at the National Nanotechnology Initiative meeting in Washington. It's about right. The group at the Technion has now been formally treated in two centers. Tel Aviv is about as it is. Bar-Ilan is somewhat larger than it was then. Weizmann, this is the center that Reshef talked about. There is a center that Moti Heibloom deals more with the physics and the fabrication end. Hebrew University and Ben-Gurion about is there. What's important to me now is that within the scale of Israeli science, I mean, we're not that big of a country, okay? We've got a couple hundred faculty and on the order of 1,000 coworkers. And I'm not talking about low-level coworkers. I'm talking about PhD students, people with PhDs, senior scientists, postdocs who are involved in this enterprise. It's a very, very big activity for what we're doing. And in fact, the scale, the dimension scale of Israel now plays a critical role here, okay? I reference it to California because California is really a nice example of where the United States has made some really important decisions about the creation of national centers. Okay, now in California, it would be trivial to talk about, well, I want a center that will incorporate researchers in Santa Barbara, about halfway between Los Angeles and San Francisco, and in Los Angeles and in San Diego. That's easy. That's a 3-hour drive, okay? In Israel, that's on the order of what we're looking at for all centers of scientific research in the country. Okay? And what that means, I think, which is really important, is that whereas the industrialist looks at the academician's demand for redundant equipment at each of these centers and says, what do you need it for? Look at the model elsewhere where you can just go 100 miles down the road and use the electron microscope or use the extraordinary facility that's there. That's going to be true in Israel. So for example, some of you may know that Technion has just acquired a fifth Chaim beam. That's very, very big bucks. That's the kind of thing that is absolutely clear and correct will not be acquired by any other university. Okay? On the other hand, electron microscopes with price tags of $1 million, $1.5 million, $2 million are going to absolutely be redone, and there's simply no choice. And that's an investment that we're already making, partly through philanthropy, partly through government policy decisions, but we're doing it and we have no choice but to do it. Because even though the distances are relatively short, if we're going to have programs that are going to achieve a critical mass in terms of independent research output, and in terms of achieving an identity of research focus and the kind of independence that Reshev touched on, we're going to have to provide each of these centers with those tools to stand on their own feet. So I think the distance works in our favor. Certainly the Tashtiyot program proved very nicely that people can and do collaborate among all of the universities. But at the end of the day, that balance where we come over and we say, okay, but we still need to maintain independent research capabilities, independent research identities at each of these institutions is absolutely true. What I wanted to do is perhaps address very quickly the issue of research priorities, give you a little bit of a summary of the information that Dan alluded to and that Reshev alluded to, but to try to put it in context. It's clear that when we set these research priorities, there are a number of fairly obvious factors that have to be taken into account. Allocation of resources, and here I think Israel has always prided itself that our human resource, our brain power, our highly trained, our highly skilled workforce is one of those resources we have to be thinking about. The limited money available is another one we have to think about. Priority with respect to problems that are uniquely acute to this part of the world, to the setting that we live in, to the political climate that we live in, is certainly clear. The Paris Center for Peace and the emphasis they have placed both on cooperative projects within NANO, within other related issues, issue of water that we'll come to in a moment. I think those are all very real decision-making factors that are prominent on the Israeli scene. The last issue here is one that's certainly not uniquely Israeli, but I would ask very much that people keep it in mind. That is, when all is said and done, if we're funding this enterprise as a way of creating jobs, training people for these businesses and to stimulate the economy, that technological driver is very, very powerful. In many settings, it has had a number of not-so-happy consequences from the point of view of an academic researcher. It's had the consequence of creating a lot of very short-term projects. That is, I don't have the opportunity to try risky things that might fail. And we'll talk about, I think, a very positive, uniquely Israeli mechanism that does allow that sort of thing. And also what it's done is it's made, for the first time, I don't remember as a student ever going to an academic seminar where people would put up a slide with a big X through the middle saying, I'm sorry, I can't tell you that. Okay? That's part of what has happened because of this move from the lab to the IP process to the commercialization, where now we really do have to be worried about the information flow. Are we going to do the job that we should be doing in terms of transmitting information and promoting the growth of science as we should be doing it, or are we in fact going to have these blocks along the way because of the intimacy of the relationship of the research scientist in academia and his industrial counterpart? Very real issues that are involved in the priority setting process. Just to pull together some of the numbers for you, civilian R&D not only is high, but has been going up dramatically here in Israel. I think very much to our credit, despite all the other stuff that's been going on around us, we've managed to maintain an extraordinarily positive trend. The idea that we are among the highest in the world in terms of the R&D percentage of our gross national product, I think, again, is very, very much to our credit, hanging in around 4 to 5%, whether that's this year's number or last year's number, plus minus a little. The bottom line is, Israel as a country has made a commitment to civilian R&D that I think has served it very well. Issue number one that has helped us here. Issue number two is very interesting, and many of you, I only made Aliyah 10 years ago. So the phenomena was one really that the Vatikim will identify much better than I. But it's an interesting statistic. Israel as a country has more than twice the percentage of trained scientists and engineers than any other country in the world. Okay? Now, where is this from? The Russian Aliyah. Okay? But the consequence of that in terms of our technologically aware and capable workforce has been extraordinary. Despite other limitations, second in the world per capita research publications, third in the world in patents. Okay? Now, we're doing something right. We're taking advantage of these resources, no matter how scarce they may be, and I think that's something that has to be mentioned, that has to be brought to the fore as an important part of what's enabling the Israeli economy and scientific enterprise to move forward. I'm going to skip through this. There is some very nice data that was put together for me by people at the Israel Science Foundation in terms of distribution, both of publications within the nano world, materials, nanobio, and optics clearly dominate. So too in patent applications, a lot of activity, new materials, new paradigms, both for the biological and for the electronic side. That's part of what's out there. The latest process of prioritization leading to the productivity that we see has come about, I think can be summarized very quickly. The Israel Science Foundation, going back on the order of 8 or 9 years, has not been targeted on a single area, okay? And I think as was said correctly before, there are only a few foundations here in Israel that are funding research in a generic sense. The Israel Science Foundation, a number of binational foundations, binational with the United States, with Germany, limited numbers of opportunities. Most of those do not have any kind of real predetermined focus. It's a sort of bottom-up driver, which allows the scientists tremendous flexibility. And yet, if you go back through the projects they funded and you look at nano, things that one can identify from the abstract of the proposal as being nano-related, there's a fairly significant investment that's been made, both in the research budgets and in equipment grants, which are even more obviously important to all of this. The Israel Academy established a program some years ago, which I think has to be noted, and they deserve to be congratulated for, and they clearly were a trendsetter relative to the European Union. The idea that we need to provide some mechanism for the risky ideas, for the things that are by no means surefire winners, but if we're not going to do them, we're not going to have what to move forward with. What we call Bikura in Hebrew, or the first program, in fact, has been a model for a comparable program that was instituted a couple years later by the European community. It's really been very successful. Nanoscience has been one of the focus areas for much of the existence of this program. And these numbers in terms of projects that are funded for 2 or 3 years with a full recognition that they're high risk. Okay? It's a different review process, a separate pot of money, but I think a tremendous debt of gratitude is owed by the scientific community in Israel to the Israel Academy for having taken the initiative to put this in place, because it's something that allows us, without compromising, it was really new money, without compromising progress and sustainable progress in other areas, has still enabled us to get into new fields, nanotechnology, biotechnology being among them. The process that Dan mentioned earlier, going back a few years, where Tel Aviv, which is kind of an umbrella for research activities in Israel, first appointed the Maidan Commission, or the National Nanotechnology Commission, and the charge is indicated in the 3 bullets there. Let's see what's going on, let's see what our infrastructure is, and let's try to develop a plan. Within about a half a year or so, a little more, a set of recommendations did emerge, which specifically mandated the government to be proactive in this area. Please keep in mind, by 2002, nano was already fairly well along. So it's not as if we were leading the curve in this. But at very least, there was a response from the government which said, okay, We've got to pull together our resources, and from a variety of agencies, there was a sense that we had to somehow make order and encourage this sort of activity. Tel Aviv, within a month or two of having received those recommendations, established the Israeli National Nanotechnology Initiative. We're going back about 3 years now. And in fact, it did. The mission of this INNI was to formulate policy. Please note some of the priorities that were identified already there. Water desalination was certainly one of them. There were a few others. But I think that was the beginning of a process. And I must tell you, there aren't that many other settings that one can look at around the world where there was sort of a concerted evaluation and then, okay, let's see if we can in some way encourage this. To some extent, it cuts against the trend that we commented on before of bottom-up research by trying to at least provide incentive to tackle specific problems. The budget Dan mentioned before, the deliverables were mentioned before, the allocation process in terms of equipment that has been funded, in terms of this item, which some of you could pick it up without listening too terribly closely to Reshev's comments, has been somewhat controversial within Israeli academia as to whether or not funding of nano centers should be on a matching basis to private philanthropy or whether a purely merit and peer-reviewed process should exist. But these are the sorts of things that have happened. The office that I would like to cite as having been most influential in nano research is the Office of the Chief Scientist in the Ministry of Industry, Trade, and Labor. There, this program was just announced a few months ago, where there are very clear incentives. We're going to increase our funding percentages. We're going to change the way we treat depreciation. We're going to change the way we structure the projects in terms of time period. This is a clear statement that Eli Ofer and his office have decided this is something we have to push. These are perks that are being extended both to nanotechnology and to biotechnology projects. And that's a very clear policy statement. The NFM magnet, in fact, is a very big project. It's a project which, in Israeli terms, we talk about 12 to 13 million euros for 3 years. It's a project involving 3 universities, 14 companies, probably will be extended for another 2 years. It's a big project and one that has shown tremendous success. What I would draw your attention to is that the roster of companies involved in it is very diverse. Some of you may recognize here both well-established as well as little startups. What I want to show you, though, in terms of, again, a policy decision, is that we're hitting the low-tech end of nano. We're hitting particles that we're going to put into fabrics. We're hitting delivery of agrochemicals. We're hitting polyolefin films for greenhouses, again, with the particles that are put in. We're not doing quantum dots. We're not talking about what I would call the sexier, more high-profile nano applications. What the Office of the Chief Scientist said is, let's try to identify those areas which on one hand will push nanotechnology forward, but on the other hand will bring some relatively immediate benefit. Okay, there are some specific programs, Nataf in water and Nofar also in bio and nano, and I just want to get to one last issue. We are participating now, there is a move afoot in the European community to coordinate nanoscience funding policies. This consortium under a European Research Era grant, this Nanoscience ERA, is one that I am representing the Israel Science Foundation in. And what you see here is a mix of countries, France, Austria, Finland, people who are both scientific professionals, that is university professors, as well as administrators, coming together to try to get a handle both on what the policies have been from country to country, as well as how should we be offering opportunities for countries to learn from each other's experiences. And that's something that's happening very nicely. And here, just a final thought. Where can we put some responsibilities here? In other words, is there a place where we can say to people, okay, you've talked about policy things, where does your piece of the pie in terms of your responsibilities going forward? And I would just mention these 3, though the list is really far longer. Individual researchers, yeah, we've got to do the science, but one of the things that has happened in this era of competition for funding, and in the era with mass communication and a lot of publicity available very easily, a lot of people may remember, I wouldn't call them fiascos, but if you will, things that didn't deliver quite the promise, which were first typed not in peer-reviewed literature, but were in fact interviews for the newspaper, for the television. That's something that I think the individual researcher has to produce the science, has to make sure it's published in a useful and intellectually rigorous way. Universities and the research centers have a major role in public education. I think Miriam's example of reaching down into the high school community is a wonderful example. In general, the extracurricular activities that go beyond the classical role of the university, I think, is important. I think the government, in terms of its policies, does have the responsibility to emphasize, on one hand, research progress, but on the other hand, to make sure that both regulation and the promotion of this research doesn't tie the hands of the researchers who, at least in the case of the real track record that's been accumulated here in Israel, have already demonstrated a very high degree of success. Thank you very much.
I want to thank you, Chaim and Dan, for their excellent presentation. And I would like to invite to the concluding session the following speakers during those 2 days of conference. Professor Gray, please. Professor Osman, please. Professor Fedorov, Dr. Rabinowitz, Professor Sukenik, Professor Kortal, Professor Rafalovich, and Professor Wworld, please. I will just moderate that. That's their problem too. And we think that one of the issues that was not brought up in these 2 days of conference was the concept of accountability, if I'm not mistaken. I've never heard that concept from any of the speakers.
Name tags.
Okay. Do you have this?
Oh, yes. The chairs were fixed.
So, I think we should start this question and answer session with this larger question that I just popped out of my mind, if it's okay with you, is where is the accountability rests? Please. I would really appreciate every speaker to have 3 to 5 sentences, if possible, summarizing their viewpoints, and after that we'll open it to the questions and answer of this of the audience, please. We'll start from Professor Rafalovich, please. Okay?
The accountability, right?
But no, you can answer whatever. Just use the microphone.
Okay.
You can put it down on whatever. Exactly.
I think the accountability, as with any science, really rests on the researcher. As when you have your own group and you're managing people and you're doing research, there's a certain amount of ethical responsibility involved. And as a scientist, especially we talked about nanotechnology and different things. Nano is really, it's a buzzword. We're doing science like anybody else. And the ethics of reporting accurately and correctly what you've discovered is really incumbent on every scientist. There's nothing special or weird or different between nanotechnology and any other science. Nano is basically just a metric. We are just scientists and we're here to report our findings. That's it.
Thank you. Professor Wworld?
No,
No,
we've changed seats.
Oh, you changed seats?
Yeah.
So Professor Kortal? Oh, okay. Please. Sorry.
Okay, well, I guess the issue of responsibility is rather complex because there are several actors in the field, several stakeholders. So scientists, sure, they have a responsibility to do good work, to be integer, to respond to the public, to communicate. I guess science, so let's say the larger structure, has also a responsibility to develop, I should call it a kind of risk regulatory science. So a regulatory science that takes into account the risks that we're talking about. And we have already seen that scientists are busy with this. So the lectures yesterday of Kevin and today of Marian, they were already responding to the special risks that are connected with nanotechnology. Then we have governments, as a matter of fact. I guess they have also a huge responsibility with respect to the tax-paying money that goes into the field, but not only the tax-paying money, also the goals of a society. That's a political thing. And I guess the goals of society has also to do with the priorities of research. So do we want to have our priority in nanotechnology in improving tires? Or do we want to have an improvement of our water supply? That's all up to, let's say, the local, national, international government. And I guess this is the main priority, a main responsibility for the governments. But as a matter of fact, citizens, they also have a certain responsibility. It's their money, it's their life, it's their culture, it's their future. So they have to take in, to participate in consultations about science, and I guess that the government has to do has to take some responsibility for organizing these consultations, and consultations about not only risk and risk perceptions, but especially about the priorities of research. So I guess this is one list, and I guess it's enough.
Thank you, Professor Kortals. I will go for my order, with your permission. Professor Wayland.
I'm not sure I have a lot to add from what Miriam has said. I think, of course, scientists scientists clearly are accountable. They need to prosecute their research in a most honest and effective way as they can. I think there are some challenges in nanoscience in the sense that some of us, perhaps Miriam included, we're having to try to understand different disciplines. Trained as a physicist, but I'm having to learn biology and write papers which are perhaps would be seen as a sort of biology-related paper or life science-related paper, and that's challenging, and perhaps I don't do it as well as a biologist would do. So I think there are some extra challenges there for nanoscientists in terms of retaining that sort of scientific credibility and integrity, given the sort of broadness, the broadness of the field and the anticipated benefits that will come from the fact that it is broad and interdisciplinary and acting at the fringes of conventional, more mainstream activities.
Thank you. Professor Fedorowicz, please. Professor Fedorowicz. Fedorov. Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry for...
Rather than say where I think responsibility should lie, I would like to focus people on the successes that and the lessons that can be learned from the experience of people in introducing biotechnology. I would like to remind people that it was scientists themselves who came together and said, we're going into the unknown. There may be unexpected properties of recombinant organisms that we can't see from here. It was the scientists who went to the National Institutes of Health and said, would you put together a committee, and the NIH responded, to formulate guidelines. That committee had, could someone turn off that? That committee consisted not just of scientists, but of ethicists. It had representatives from organizations that actually opposed recombinant DNA research. It was an open forum. All the meetings were open to the public. Now,
we're experiencing some nano problems.
And contrary to the perception that it was a failure, in fact, it was quite a success in the sense that the original guidelines were highly prohibitive of many, many types of cloning. As experience accumulated, and this was all reviewed in an open forum, open to the public and open to the newspapers, the guidelines were gradually rewritten and relaxed. As people accumulated the knowledge, there was a mechanism for responding to that accumulated knowledge. Now, when the process was taken over by regulatory agencies, that flexibility was lost. And I would submit to you that if you are designing a process that will be properly cautious in the face of the unknown, but yet not so prohibitive that you cannot learn, because the only way we can know what hazards lie in wait for us is to go for
that you develop a regulatory process that is responsive to accumulating knowledge. We've gotten stuck in the United States because the minute that laws are applied and regulations are applied, you lose the flexibility of responding to accumulating knowledge. We have not solved that problem. It stands, in particular, I would say that although today companies are dismissed as somehow greedy and monopolizing this area, it is not true. It is the reason that companies dominate in production of genetically modified food plants is because it is so prohibitively expensive to get through the regulatory process that academic scientists have been driven out of the game. Now, why is it important that academic science, not just academic, but agricultural scientists, some of whom work for national organizations, be allowed to contribute is that there are many, many crops that are very local, that don't have a big market, that companies will never exploit, and yet can be improved for local farmers. This is a scale-independent technology, and to be able to craft a regulatory process that is suitably cautious, but also appropriately responsive to accumulating knowledge, so that it can be relaxed when it becomes apparent that there aren't the hazards that we all sat around and thought up at the outset. That is what will allow innovation to go forward, and I would encourage people who are involved in nanotechnology to be mindful of that particular experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Fedorov. Sorry. Professor Osman, please.
I hate to be something of an idealist, but I'm going to give you sort of a pragmatic answer here. The responsibility lies with who uses society to decide the responsibility lies with. If you look at how different societies have decided on something as simple as motorcycle helmets, whether people should wear those, mandated in the United States, there are other places it's not, or state by state level in the United States. And to some extent, that is protecting people from themselves in many regards when you have that kind of law in place. The question is are you as a society going to take the stance that you need to protect people from themselves? And what standard are you going to use to determine that? I'm a scientist. Part of what I do is determining some of the hazards of some nanomaterials. You heard about some of that last night. But do I think I should be deciding for you whether you're going to take that nanomaterial in a particular formulation and use it as a cosmetic or not? I think that I should give you the information and you should make your own decision based on that information. I can make recommendations, but I don't think you would want me to make a decision for you. So the question really comes down to the scientists being responsible for giving the information, the public taking the responsibility for making their decisions, and the government making a decision based on society's input, whether they're going to leave the responsibility in society's hands or take it upon themselves.
Thank you, Professor Osman. Professor Gray, please.
Well, I think this question of responsibility has been addressed very well. I wanted to talk about something else that I think is a responsibility that faces all of us, whether we are the scientists, the government, the private sector, the citizens of a society. And that is as we think about using these technologies. That's really what we're talking about. Genetic modification is technology. Very small materials are part of the technology. There are lots of other technologies we have to think about. The important question to me is how we frame the issue we're addressing. With genetic modification, for example, I heard earlier some people suggesting the question is, should we have GM or not? Another way of framing the question, one that I think is perhaps more productive, is how are we going to produce our food? Every alternative that we face has its own series of risks and benefits. Low-impact farming requires more area to be put under cultivation. That has potential effects for ecosystems. High-input farming has potential risks from perhaps fertilizers and pesticides. Genetic modification as a way to control some of those pests may have its own issues. We can't think about these problems in isolation. The hard part of living in our society is making choices, making these difficult choices. I think the role of scientists is to provide information. I think there's a role for people who do analysis to bring that information together. But ultimately, these decisions about how we face these choices come down to joint decisions made by civil society, by the governments, by the private sector, and people who are going to be affected by the ultimate choices that we make.
Thank you, Professor Gray. Dr. Rabinowitz?
Yes, accountability. It's good. We like accountability.
Do you
The
have
more the better. But of course, there is a paradox here. The action and responsibility do not lie with the same actor. I think in this particular case, very obviously, but it's in other realms as well. Industry is the main actor here. We heard some figures about where the money is coming from and where the benefits are going to. But industry is really exempt of accountability. It's accountable to, shareholders, but that's not the kind of accountability that we're talking about. And of course, the state, by definition, is the responsible agent. And we are living in a world in which states are receding. They are taking off. They're shedding off more and more of their willingness and sometimes ability to supervise and regulate. And I think that the nanotechnology is probably a good example in which states generally, not necessarily Israel, are latecomers into events and into processes that have sort of started without them. Yes, I would be looking for the state for regulation and accountability, and we have a solution to the cumbersome problem that you were talking about in the States, and that is in Israel, regulation and law is only a recommendation. So we could have our regulatory bodies and still, go ahead with business.
Thank you, Dr. Rabinowitz. Professor Sukenik, please.
I would just add one very brief comment, that is, I think it's clear that the decisions of the consumer act almost as a self-regulating mechanism, and to the extent that we educate the consumer and make the information available, that will prove itself. The place where I'm a little more concerned is in the decision-making process that allows the research and that allows the activity to move forward, and there the accountability that I would very much like to see is a strengthening and maintenance of a peer review process, whether it's in terms of scientific information that is published, whether it's in terms of grants that allow the science to go forward. I think the absolute primacy of that as the mechanism for making decisions in this arena is clear. The input of public policy and public policy makers is real and is important, but at the end of the day, the need, despite the seeming loop of the cat watching the milk, or whatever the appropriate analogy is, there doesn't seem to be, near as I can tell, any better mechanism. That is, the knowledgeable investigator is in fact the best critic of other proposals, of other pieces of work, and of other assessments of technology and science. And I think at the end of the day, strengthening that peer review process at every level is going to be very important.
Thank you, Professor Sukenik. Professor Osman asked for a rebate?
Yeah.
Okay, please.
A small response.
A short one.
Yes, a couple of sentences. I've heard several of the speakers, as well as a number of private conversations, talking about industry, and in particular, the short-sightedness of industry with respect to profits for shareholders and so on. That was certainly my impression before I started getting involved in health impacts of nanomaterials and environmental impacts. Once we did that, the scientists were coming to me and saying, don't do this work, because it's going to shut down the industry. The companies were coming to me and saying, do this work. We want this stuff done because nobody's going to trust us. We want you guys to work on this information. They are scared to death of another asbestos scare. They're scared to death about liability in the long term. And that in and of itself is making, in many regards, the industrial concerns, in my opinion, more responsible than some of the academic concerns.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I add a word to that?
Just a word?
Just a
please, because the audience is waiting for their share of time.
I would second, I would underscore that, in fact, the reason that industry does comply, and did comply even when we had just guidelines and not regulations, is because they are fearful of lawsuits, and as long as they comply with guidelines and regulations, they can at least in court point to having complied with them. And so I agree.
Thank you. The floor is open, please.
One thing I just wanted to comment in terms of trusting the consumers, in terms of the decisions they make to help drive things one way or another. The capitalist system does a very good job of separating the end product from all of the processes that produce it. And so to trust someone who's trying to decide whether to pick this thing or that thing from a Walmart or whatever other shop you want to pick shelf, they're very often going to make it on price or on whatever other smaller features. And so I think it's very divorced from all the other processes. In fact, in recent discussions in the United States about obesity and other things, it's been pointed out that economically, and if you're making your foods based on economics, the offers by the fast food chains are hard to pass up. You're getting a lot of food for a very small amount of money, but it's not necessarily the best choice. And so the types of decisions that consumers are going to make and the types of choices they're presented with are ones that very often totally divorce the process that produces that product and even how good it is for them from whether or not it's a good idea for food. They're going to do what works for their economy, for their budget, and so on. And so I think to push it onto them is to accountability has to rest with the public in terms of paying attention to what's going on. But I think trying to rely on it in terms of consumer dollars and people walking with their wallets is a very poor way of thinking about it.
Thank you for the comment, please. Short questions and short comments, please. Stephanie?
I would like to say that, we're talking about individual states that actually live on one planet, and therefore, I think one of the things that we look at is how science or application of technologies in one area impact the rest of the planet, and take that into consideration when we start to design or regulate where we're going with particular science. That's an important, especially from the next 1,000 years, probably be critical to think how does this, all of it impact sustainable development? How does it all impact the planet? Because if we don't see that clearly, then we get bit by the stuff that we do.
The panelists are invited to answer or to comment on those comments, please. It's your time too.
I just wanted to make one short comment. I agree with what was just said right now, because again, you can't trust, obviously business will do whatever's economically profitable. Their time scale is not global and it's not very long. So the ultimate responsibility, again, I think rests with the scientists, because the scientists reporting facts. And whatever we have, that's the only thing that the scientist has the facts, and it's the responsibility of the scientific community to convey these facts clearly to the public. And then the public can make a decision that's later on correspondent to their representatives and their legislators.
Professor Kotter, please.
Yeah, also a short comment on the two comments. First, the issue of consumer choice. I agree that it is very difficult for consumers, especially in the Western world, to get knowledge and information on what's going on in the market. So it's a burden for them to put all the responsibility to them. But on the other hand, we see that in Europe especially, consumer concerns with respect to food have emerged the last 20 years because of all these catastrophes or all these problems we had. So consumers do more than voting with their purse. They have commands on animal welfare, they have commands on fair treatment of farmers in developing and developed world. So these kind of things. So, and I guess it's partly, well, not partly. I guess the consumer should be more involved into the food chain and in what happened in food research. We have been, as city dwellers, let's say, we have been catapulted out of the rural areas. We have been immigrated out of the rural areas. I guess we should look for new communication channels with the rural areas and with the production of our food. So that's what's with respect to the consumer choice. With respect to the business, I would say that indeed it's a very good thing that there are these large corporations. There's no problem about that. The issue is that the interest of these large corporations are different from public interest, and we should take that in mind. And we should be careful in putting public interest things into the decision-making process of business. And this can be, let's say, science, because science should be open. So in that sense, we need peer review, we need publications, we need sharing the results. We don't need patents in science. Patents are something that, partly close off knowledge. And if merit is only regulated by patents and not by publications, this will be a bad thing. So with respect to science, we should be careful. With respect to the public interest, we should be careful to put it in the hands of business. But business can have a lot of interesting things, can produce new things. It works often much faster than universities. It works often much faster than governments. But the long-term public interest is indeed not safe in the hands of business, and that's the reason that we have governments. So governments have, in my view, a special responsibility for the long-term view.
Thank you. Please.
Just finish for comments. Professor Sukenik, you spent a big part of towards the end of your presentation in showing how great a position Israel has attained per capita in research. That's the past until now, but there are these new factors of thousands of teachers being fired, the government politically broadening university appointments for colleges around the country, diffusing research capabilities, and what I commented on earlier, I think that the projection for the future is not so glowing for Israel's place as far as research contribution worldwide. My second point is that...
Can we hold for the first, then Melvin will have time for the second? Is that okay? Please, for Sukenik. Okay.
Okay. The second point is that a presentation was made how risks can be quantified and somebody has to pay for the risks and you can get insurance. The thing is not, it's the risk. What the risk is, it's not risk. It's not money. It's life that we're talking about. And just finally, we learn, rabbis teach us that before the flood came, that magicians of the day were fooling around with what they call kishta, fooling around with life. Maybe there are some things that, we don't have to do anything just because we now know how to do it. I mean, we're talking here about this is life, and God has created life, and why should we play around with it? What right do we have to play around?
Thank you. Professor Sukenik?
These sound like loaded questions of the first order.
Your answers should not be.
They will not be, and they'll be very brief. The response to where I see Israel headed, I confess that I am optimistic. I see very good people working very hard and doing very good work. And I see this work being extremely well received around the world in journals, at conferences, and with the highest regard. What will happen? How will cuts or changes in the budgeting at high school education affect the science we can do 10 years from now, 5 years from now? I don't know. I can't prognosticate, but I think it's a little premature to start ringing a death knell for Israeli science based on whether or not it's getting adequate high school support. The other issue of whether or not we should be doing what we can do, I think that's what public policy is all about. Scientists have a responsibility to show the public policy makers what can be done. They have a responsibility to delineate the limits of those capabilities, to define the risks in those capabilities, and at that point to allow the public to make an informed decision about how far we should push it. But to say that we shouldn't be tampering, I believe, is short-circuiting the process, and there's no need to do that.
Professor Osman, please.
To address the middle comment about risk, the risk, science never gives 100% answers with 100% certainty. There are always questions about it. You can be fairly certain of something, but there could always be something you haven't considered as a possibility. But yet, we still have to make decisions about what product to use, how to live our lives. Yes, we are talking about life, not just a numerical monetary risk, absolutely. But we still have to make decisions based on incomplete information. Very quick example here. If you look at some of the titanium dioxide use in sunscreens right now, there's been some data that's been shown in the last couple of days that would make you somewhat worried. There's been some data that might be somewhat reassuring. But as was mentioned a few minutes ago, there's a question of choice among what options. If you don't use sunscreen, then we know what many of the dangers of ultraviolet radiation on the skin is. And we also know what was in the prior formulations of sunscreen. And frankly, from what I know of those, I'm not sure I want to be rubbing those on my skin. So those seem to be the three main options we have. We have something with known high risk of the sun. We have something with a relatively known, somewhat lower risk, but still a risk, which is the old formulations. And we've got something with a relatively unknown risk, which is the new formulations. We are faced with having to make that decision which one we're going to use.
Okay. You please.
I feel that the fate of nanoparticles in the environment has not been at risk, and especially if it could reach water sources, if we would drink it, if it's possible to treat it through the standard water treatment plants, if it could reach wastewater streams or flotation to biosolids or sludge, and all the issue of what will happen to the environment.
Okay, Professor Flovich.
Listening to what's going on here reminds me a little bit about before people think nano is very small. Actually, femto is a lot smaller. Femto is the size scale of nuclear physics. That was originally nuclear physics. Right? I think polymer is the largest scale of nano. If you go back to the beginning of nuclear physics, sort of the end of World War II, very little was known about nuclear physics. I remember reading a book that said in case of a nuclear explosion, close the windows and hide under your desk. People didn't realize what the hazards were, but later on with experience and with honesty and scientific investigation, it became clear what the problems were. And it's the same thing now and then now you have a nuclear regulatory commission that knows exactly how to regulate it. And it's the same thing with nanotechnology right now. It's a very rapidly emerging field. And when you're saying about cleaning up the water, you can't wear a filter against nanoparticulates in the air because your filter is not nano-sized. It's very difficult to protect yourself because it's an unknown science. But the solution is more research, more investigation, not less, because nano is there. And as we begin to understand it and the new physics that regulates it, I think we'll know how to protect ourselves against it better.
Questions that you brought up are extremely good ones. What happens to nanoparticles in the environment? Where do they partition? What happens at the bottom of the food chain? These sorts of things. What happens to groundwater? What happens to water supplies? Those are unknown, and we are, in my center, currently looking at a number of those questions to try to answer them, trying to look at the environment, precisely because they're important questions.
Thank you, Professor Tamadayan. And this is the last question, please. Oh, afterward.
Scientists may have the answers to a lot of questions, but a biotechnologist or a nanotechnologist may not have necessarily the data or may not necessarily understand the data about the environmental repercussions of their technology. Now, we've heard about amazing technologies, and we also understand they may have some environmental impact. So obviously, we want to continue to develop them here to stay. We need to think of how we're going to do the research
That's a very general question, I think, or comments that we should take up at your MAP committee also, with your permission. Please.
The word public has been mentioned today hundreds of times, and there is a consensus that we have to participate the public in the decision making, no doubt about it. So my question is very practical. Who is this public? In other words, we have the scientists and we have the formal representatives of the public, which are the politicians and the technocrats in the government. When we say public, we mean something else. So my question is, how do we determine this public? Are these only the activist groups, the most activists, the most radical ones? Who should be satisfied in participation of the public?
Well, I couldn't think about a concluding remark for each one of you, but this is the concluding remark. I would appreciate if you can comment on this in 1 or 2 sentences, please. Thank you.
I actually, in an answer to your question, I'm beginning to resent a little bit when people say, why don't scientists think about the environment? Because we do. I mean, that's the whole point of this research, is to consider the impact of what we do on our bodies and the environment, because they're interconnected. We live in this environment. And as an example, every time we mention these clays, in the case of nanotechnology, there was a distinction made between nanoparticles that are attached or embedded and those that are floating in solution because of the environment. Some of it is aqueous and some of it is solid. But it's very easy to convert from one to another. For example, if you have fires, if something burns, then you go from something solid to something that goes and pollutes the air. These are concerns that we think about all the time, and that does go into our grants when we consider it. When you say about who the public is, the public to me is just the general population. I report the facts. And then the voter and everybody else, the man in the street, it's up to him to decide.
Professor Kortels, please.
Yeah, also with respect to the last question, but also to the other one. And that's a question, and I have it to the panel. With respect to the environmental risk and the health risk. I am a layperson, I guess, maybe, well, you also are from the social sciences, isn't it? So I would like to ask the panel, what do you think, what do you estimate, how much attention should science pay to these risk regulatory issues, in the sense of doing research in the risk, like Kevin was telling us what his research center was doing and so on. Is it at 1/5? Is it 1/10? I mean, this is also probably a kind of advice to a science policy. So that is my question. And the other thing, that is, it's not a question, but it's more, let's say, a command on involving the public. Yes, that's a difficult thing, because we should be very careful not to have the entrenched positions of the NGO. Lots of NGOs, they are responsible, they're acting in a responsible ways, but there are NGOs that have a very entrenched position, and we should be very careful not to entrench this more. So not to invite representatives of an NGO, because then it is clear that he or she will only represent the position. So you should try to loosen the interest basis of those organizations. And in Denmark, in Scandinavian countries, in the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, we have some experience with organizing these kind of debates. There are several types of, you can have citizen juries, you can have focus groups, you can have expert meetings. There are several types of ways of deliberation and consultations, and I can give you, if you want, some publications or literature.
Professor Sukenik, please.
I guess I would make a very clear distinction. That is, the responsibility of the scientist is very much to convey the information, to find the information. I think the decision or the prioritization of economic issues versus environmental issues versus potential scientific gain is a debate that has to be held publicly, where the scientists are a player but not the only player. At the end of the day, depending on how responsive any given political system is, it is going to be the political network that's going to have to make those decisions. They're the ones that are going to coordinate funding decisions and prioritization. And at the end of the day, hopefully they are responsible to the broader public. I think that's a charge to the political scientists among us and a charge to all of us to make sure that our representatives are responsive to the issues and the concerns that we hold dear.
Thank you, Professor Wayland.
I said that the Royal Society report had recommended that the government looked into more public engagement, and there is in fact, just for your information, in The Guardian next Thursday, there's going to be announced a series of citizen juries called NANO Jury UK that will go across the UK over the next few months. That will, a report will go back from those to the government, and the government have promised a response. So that's a hard fact, if you like. But to your imponderable question about what the public is. When I started this Royal Society report, I had exactly the same concerns. They became more prevalent as time went on. I had less and less idea. And the more, in fact, I spoke to especially NGOs, the more I realized that the public was almost a myth. And just to give you one example, I gave a talk at something called the Cheltenham Science Festival, which is just an open science festival for the public last year. And I mentioned this at one of these NGO meetings, and I was told that this was not the public that I spoke to. It was a self-selecting, self-interested group of the public who could afford the transport to go to Cheltenham. So your frustrations, I'm afraid, don't have a solution.
Thank you. Dr. Rabinowitz?
Yes, I think outreach to the public is essential here. It is true that the public is a myth, but it is a myth that sometimes has manifestations. Sometimes it emerges. The problem about environmental issues generally, not necessarily these technologies, is that they're all long-term, info-intensive, indirect, complicated, and they always come second and third. And it's not something that can happen, with a flick of a button. You call the public in and it'll be there. I think the relevance and the success of Citizens Council, we call them, Vidat Ezrachim, in Israel, in terms of some environmental issues like transportation, was impressive. And in fact, it was a pleasant surprise that it actually worked for the first time about 3 years ago, and then they keep doing it. I think that it goes back to some of the points that I was making about how genuine and how sincere are the actors who are actually pushing these technologies, whether in the academy or in industry or in the government. It is a function of how genuine and sincere and determined they are to seek out the public to overcome all these problems about the mythified entity out there, which we would all very dearly like to consult but cannot always find. It may surprise you, but I do share some of the criticism that was voiced about organizations and about NGOs. They have agendas, they have institutional interests, they have positionality like others. They do not have to be ignored, but they have to be taken with a pinch of salt.
Thank you. Professor Fedorov.
I honestly don't have an answer to that question. The reason that I am here, the reason that I actually wrote a book on this subject, is because it has been very hard to watch the techniques, the contemporary techniques for modifying plants trashed in the way that they've been trashed, in the face of growing evidence that they're perfectly safe. I have spent the last 6 months touring the country talking to anyone who would come and buy a book. The book reading public is very small. I have gotten to know more about bookstores than I knew before, and they're all wringing their hands saying people don't read it. So how and then going back to my experience on the Recombinant Advisory Committee, it was indeed people who have an ideological position who showed up at the meetings. It wasn't a cross-section of the public at large. That is generally true of advisory committees to the government. It's my experience in being on advisory committees to the FDA, to the USDA. There's always a smattering of what we would call the public, but they are representatives of the Consumers Union or Greenpeace or some organization that has a stake in the issue. How do you reach the public? I don't know, unless you get on a primetime television sitcom. They have no intellectual content. You're not going to present science in that fashion. Even public television that airs programs on which I've done, by the way, so I've taken every opportunity, and yet those reach a tiny fraction of the population. This is a real dilemma.
Thank you. Professor Osman.
I think that the people before me have pretty well summed up my views on the public as well. I agree with most of those comments. When I was speaking of public having an input into the process, I was mostly referring to consumer forces. Anyway, to address the other question that was raised of how much should how much money should be spent on the environmental impacts, these sorts of things. My take on this is that setting a number is really impossible. It's going to be very dependent upon whether the particular material you're looking at is currently in a product or not, whether it's being suggested for a product that we are using directly in contact with humans, or whether it's going to be something that's encapsulated, for example, inside a computer chip. I think all of those factors make it have potential impacts that range from absolutely nothing is even conceivable to be a problem from it, all the way through, we better study this pretty darn hard. And so I think that setting a number is really dangerous, because it's going to put funding in places that it shouldn't be put.
Thank you, Professor Gray.
On this question of the public, my understanding from colleagues from the literature makes me hopeful for talking to the public about certain kinds of questions. And again, this goes back to my previous comment that what's important here is how we frame the question. It's quite evident that on problems of local interest with local people involved, where a solution is required, what are we going to do with our waste? People can do a very good job of being engaged, being involved, working with experts, and coming to solutions. When we get to bigger questions, many of the things that we're talking about here today, how should Israel, how should the United States, how should the European Union address a particular technology or particular issue, I'm in the camp with the rest of the folks that the public really is a myth. I think that consultation with NGOs is a way to learn what people are thinking. But ultimately, I think that we have to rely on voters and the way in which they reflect their wants and needs through the kinds of governments we have, who are ultimately going to make and enforce these decisions. Consultation is useful, but we cannot rely on those people to make the decision. I think that has to go to more concrete groups.
Well, in UNESCO, we still don't have that answer for public, but we do have a new concept that we call the civil society, and sometimes it involves NGOs, sometimes individuals, sometimes large communities, and sometimes everybody. And I think that the issue of public is an issue of almost any policy that you may want to address in any issue in Israel or in the world. I want to thank the panelists for their contributions, and I want to thank on behalf of the International Commission, the cooperation between the Porter School Studies, Environmental Studies, and the Fulbright Foundation, and especially Michal Ben-Dori, that really did a great job, and I think she deserves. Thank you very much for your attention. I have to tell you this. Hagit and I go back very long time, and I think I owe her that. And please, Hagit, Professor Hagit Messeron, please, for concluding remarks, will you stay for 2 more seconds? Thank you.
First he forced me to come here, and then he forgot about it. But
I want to say regarding the question, who is the public? So today I was the public. I was sitting here all day listening to you, and it was marvelous. So on behalf of the public, I want to thank our guests, our local speakers, the audience. It was really wonderful day, very interesting. Thank you all, and have a good evening. Bye-bye.
The question of whether it can be maintained is a very real question. That politics tends to be less responsive